to Prolespod.
Hello and welcome to Prolespod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture, without the liberalism. We are currently in part 4 of the Stalin Eras, from 1940 to 1953, and I am your host, the other Jeremy. Probably you don't know exactly who the other Jeremy is, and my full name's Jeremy Shepard. You can find me on YouTube at Intervenciones Gringas, which is a channel entirely in Spanish. I never really make content in English, but if you speak Spanish and you want to learn about U.S. crimes in Latin America, come on over. And if you don't speak Spanish, that's fine too. Keep in mind, this episode is based on the narrative that was covered in the previous episodes. So if you've not listened to those episodes, go listen to those first. Seriously, turn this off. Go listen to the other episodes. All right, are you back? Good. Now that we're all up to speed, you can find the Proles on most social media platforms at Prolespod, and on TikTok, it's proles.pod. If you want to help them reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the podcast catchers, it's the best way to do that. If you want to help them with their vision, you can get them some glasses. But you can also subscribe to their Patreon at patreon.com/Prolespod.
I made the same joke.
Oh, come on now. Of course we did. Over on Patreon, there's a lot of great stuff, such as early access to the main episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. Part 4 of the Stalin Eras is being helmed by Ray and Tony, but Proles Jeremy, the original Jeremy, and not this usurper who doesn't even usually speak English, are also here. So where do you guys want to begin?
Hi.
Hi, Ray. How's it going?
It's pretty good. How are you guys? Tony, Jeremy, other Jeremy, original Jeremy?
Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm excited to talk about this important time period of Soviet history that I think doesn't really get focused on much outside of World War II.
Yeah. Right, which maybe listeners would like to know that we don't focus on in this episode.
There's like a lot of World War II podcasts. Like,
there are, yeah.
So many.
And we kind of like, it was discussed at the beginning when we were planning these episodes that we were not going to focus on World War II or the Great Patriotic War as it's known in the Soviet Union or Russia today. Because one, that would be probably its own series in and of itself, and two, because there is so much content devoted to that already. Not that we're not going to talk about it, but it is going to be limited to some degree.
And a lot of the arguments that we put forth are about Stalin's movements, right? It is the Stalin Eras, and as he was not like particularly trotting about on the front lines, it's not really the focus.
Yeah, well, nobody was. I mean, really, like the last time heads of state like led their countries in battle was like 1859 or something.
Right.
So it's like by the time we get to like mechanized warfare, everyone is in the rear with the gear, you know? But yeah. All right. So we've already talked quite a bit about Stalin. We already know some stuff about him. But now I know we just said we're not going to be focusing on the World War, but I do have a question about it. Sorry. So it is about one of our favorite things, which is socialism in one country. Woo! And also about how the Soviets, well, basically why they're not speaking German today, right? The successful Soviet response during the World War, the reason that we call it the Great Patriotic War and not the big failure where Moscow got destroyed. How does that demonstrate that socialism in one country is a valid theory?
Okay, so as the resident theory head, first, we should probably talk about or refresh everybody on the theoretical differences between socialism in one country and permanent revolution, which, if you have been with us this long, you may recall we touched on in part 1. But Trotsky continues to write and speak about this through the 30s and really like until his death. So some key differences. And by the way, I want to say that I genuinely hope that this is like a fair and accurate summary. I really do, because I'm not interested in making him a cartoonish idiot who people didn't listen to because he was annoying. As an annoying person, I am interested in evaluating the merit of his ideas and drawing conclusions that are like, we would hope rooted in a material analysis. So basically, Stalin was like, we need to make the Soviet Union strong and solid. And this is like for several reasons. The first of which is that obviously these people have fucking been through it. They have paid their dues, so to speak. And Stalin understandably believes that like they deserve to reap the benefits and to live a life that was better than that of like feudal czarist Russia or whichever country they had come from before. The second reason for this is Stalin believes, and like Tony speaks about this in the narrative. Well, actually, I think I'm the one who speaks about it, but Tony wrote about it in the narrative, is where Stalin sort of has this idea that the best way to win people to their cause is to make the USSR like a cool and fun place to live with opportunities for people. So if they're focusing on doing revolution around the world, it comes at the cost of like neglecting that the opportunities and the life that they can offer for people within the USSR. Third, Stalin was very interested in supporting other revolutionary projects, and the Soviets did so to the best of their ability. And supporting revolutionary projects, IDK, if you guys know this, but it requires solid industries within the USSR, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit. But it requires good education. It requires a way to train cadres. It requires a place for people to physically meet. And again, this requires a country that is not like in fucking shambles. And finally, and this one for me, because of my, intellectual proclivities is huge, Stalin is like, you guys, permanent revolution in Trotsky's conception betrays the tenets of Marxism. And I'm going to add here also like betrays the tenets of Leninism. And for me, this is one, like I personally could never get over because it's not even a close read, right? Like the most cursory surface level read of Lenin's work is like, you can't force a revolution, but you have to be ready and be able to recognize the material conditions when they arise, right? When the capitalist systems create such inherent and enormous contradictions, the material conditions for revolution will be present, and it's our job to be able to assess them so that we can act. But you can't really force it, right? So we'll get into Trotsky's arguments and why at first, years ago, terrible confession, to be honest, I kind of found them compelling, and we're going to talk about it a little bit. But suffice it to say, I could never be fully won over to this side because at the end of the day, having access to the Soviet army or whatever is not at all sufficient conditions for a revolution. Okay, so with that said, these are sort of Stalin's reasons for why the Soviet Union needs to be strong, needs to be solid, needs to be effective. We can talk a little bit about what Trotsky is arguing for. So he is like, Russia and the Soviet Union are too backward. Keep note of this, by the way. And they can't pull off socialism. They need help. They need trading partners. They need more socialist countries in the world so that they can sort of form blocs. I also want to say, I have said in previous episodes that I feel like Trotsky is not an unintelligent man, but he is someone who's really motivated by egotistical reasons. I don't mean to armchair psychologize him, but I've spent so many hours reading this man's work. So I do feel like I know him to an extent. And we've covered in previous episodes, he was actually very successful and very respected for the decisions that he made in the military. So it sort of seems to me that okay, you're good at doing army stuff and you just want to keep doing more army stuff. And we're going to see a little theme here. So let me give you a metaphor in the hopes that maybe you can understand this. I, as you know, was a girl boss, and I know the girl boss marketing playbook. And when you want to sell an idea to someone, right? You present them a problem that's real, but then you present your product as the solution to that problem, even though it isn't. So maybe, for example, okay, so maybe you feel I don't have enough time to take care of myself. And maybe this is a real problem that you have. But then I position my essential oils as a solution to this problem, this ritual that you can engage in to make yourself feel like you've done something for yourself. And honestly, not to shit on essential oils because I love them. But patchouli doesn't actually solve the problem that you have. This is a misdiagnosis of the problem because the genuine problem that you're having is that there are too many demands on your time and a capitalist system makes that so. And patchouli can't fix that. Okay? So Trotsky basically does this over and over and over and over again. So he's arguing socialism needs to spread internationally. Otherwise, the USSR is going to stagnate and be isolated globally. Okay? I think everyone can agree, yeah, that's objectively true. But his solution, our essential oils here, is permanent revolution, which is literally keep making wars anywhere in the world that you can. And I'm not being hyperbolic. That is actually his point. And not doing so, he suggests, is a betrayal of internationalism. Basically, he's everywhere that you're not starting a war, you're abandoning them. And so honestly, I think the characterization of his work as so-called like orthodox, I just want to, like, this is a pet peeve of mine, but I think the characterization of his work as orthodox is like actually way too generous and kind of delusional. Hot take. Ooh, should I say it? I'm going to say it. Hot take. There's no such thing as orthodox Marxism. That itself is a contradiction.
Yeah.
Because Marxism is a set of tools that need to be accurately applied to a given situation. So it cannot, by definition, become an orthodoxy. Like orthodoxy by definition is about holding to existing beliefs. Marxism is not concerned with beliefs, right?
Which is what irritates me about people who call themselves orthodox Marxists. It's like you are taking what should be a living document that we work on constantly and adjust based on conditions and saying, let's turn this into a religion where we dogmatically follow this step and then this step and then this step. And we make sure that we do things exactly the way that Marx said it was going to happen, or else it's not real Marxism, which is not what Marx would believe.
The no true Scotsman thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct.
And to your point about like Trotsky trying to sell his idea as the whatever panacea, Justin messaged the group chat last night and said that the archives just released 20 new documents, mostly related to Trotsky writing letters to Olberg and other members of that conspiracy. And he said that like 90% of them were just Trotsky being like, did you get my copy of Permanent Revolution? Do you have a copy of Permanent Revolution? Did you get that copy? If you don't have a copy, definitely make sure you get a copy because it's really important that you have a copy of
Trotsky trying to
Permanent
sign
Revolution.
up the girlies to his downline.
Yeah,
Posting your new Instagram post to your story and being like, make sure to give it lots of love.
The original Substack.
Exactly. His MLM, and I do not mean Marxist-Leninism Maoism.
I mean, the other thing too is like the whole declare war on everyone at once. Like Trotsky, like before the very last things he wrote were like, Stalin's trying to kill me. I'm probably gonna die soon, right? But before that, he wrote, hey, yeah, looks like he was right for once. But before that, he wrote about like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? And he completely divorces it from the fact that the Soviet Union reached out to Britain and France, who would be their eventual allies, and were like, can we have an alliance against Germany? And they were like, no, fuck you.
Well, they were more like, yeah, we'll get back to you. We'll get back to you on that. We will totally get back to you. Never got.
We'll
back
talk
to
about it later after you've been invaded and destroyed.
No, but that's actually like the perfect distillation of the contradiction of quote unquote orthodox Marxism, which is like, as long as you remove all of the context that is relevant to the situation, then your point stands. And it's like, well,
like
then
Lenin
isn't
wasn't
a point?
orthodox either. Like, because there had just been a civil war, and he's like, hey, we got to do a new economic program. I know, guys, I know.
and it sucks.
We'll get to it later. We have to have some private stuff.
I don't want to wait. I'm so sorry, but you have to like. Everyone has to endure Mark Trotsky because I have more thoughts about this. I don't want to get us too derailed, but it's just something that I have been thinking as I just like read about this shit. So sorry for my hot take, but in April of 1940, we get a brief little sticky note, a little letter here from our girl Trotsky called Letter to the Workers of the USSR. That's another example of the girl boss marketing that I mentioned before. And for this, I will read an excerpt. Stalin endangers the Soviet Union. If Soviet economic life had been conducted in the interests of the people, if the bureaucracy had not devoured and vainly wasted the major portion of national income, are you talking about jobs? Is he saying salary? People's salaries. When he's saying there's too much bureaucracy, the money has been wasted on too much bureaucracy. What he's saying is we paid people a living wage. Okay, I just want to clear that up. If the bureaucracy had not trampled underfoot the vital interests of the population, then the USSR would have been a great... Wait a second. I swear to God, this is real. Please, everyone can look this up. The USSR would have been a great magnetic pole of attraction. Listen, when I said girl boss, I meant law of attraction girl boss for the toilers of the world, and the inviolability of the Soviet Union would have been assured. Okay, girl. Okay, but the infamous oppressive regime of Stalin has deprived the USSR of its attractive power. Okay, skipping a little bit. The honest and advanced revolutionists have organized abroad the Fourth International, which has sections already established in most of the countries of the world. I, Trotsky, am a member of this new international. In participating in this work, I remain under the very same banner that I served together with you or your fathers or your older brothers in 1917 and throughout the years of the Civil War. The very same banner under which, together with Lenin, we built the Soviet state and the Red Army. Okay. So again, right, when I talk about the girl boss marketing, bureaucracy sucks. And like, truly, I hate to see it. But the new international, with some small chapters in some countries, is not and cannot be a solution to this problem. Also, like, for what it's worth, right, like, it denies the material reality, again, of job creation, the genuine need, like when we talk about what functions the bureaucracy was serving, the genuine need to collect data and centralize it somewhere. And the fact that, although also in this like little sticky note from Trotsky earlier that I didn't quote, he references needing to like overcome the bureaucracy of Tsarist Russia and how the Soviets somehow did this, but he fails again to include the reality that Tsarist Russia and all of these states pretty much were already extremely bureaucratic. And that's not just political, it's also social, right? This is something that original Jeremy and I discussed in part 1. It's a way of continuing to do things so that citizens literally just like understand how to participate in their own government.
And guess who else was concerned about bureaucracy? Joseph Stalin. He wrote about it quite a lot, in fact. He complained about
extensively
and warned against bureaucratization. It was a problem in the Soviet Union. He recognized it was a problem in the Soviet Union. And he was like, we need to figure out a way to overcome this, or it's going to be a problem indefinitely. Unfortunately.
There's also, though, like the job, like in the job creation thing, it's like they realized, okay, what do we do if we have people who really don't have anything to do? They can sit at home and we can not give them any money. And then you have, impoverished people. You could sit at home and we give them money and then they don't do anything. Or we can make up some useless jobs, right? And the thing is countries that do this, where there's like you go to park your car and there's a little machine that gives you the ticket, and there's also a guy there, and the guy's job is to press the button and hand you the ticket, and you're like, why does he have this job? And it's like, well, because otherwise he would be sitting at home doing nothing. And we figured out a long time ago that it's a lot cheaper to have him be here and wear a little uniform and a hat and do a thing. Like,
and also like participate in society and to try to live some semblance of a dignified life.
Totally. Like, yeah, he's got something going on. You know what I mean? Whereas I'm thinking about, in capitalist countries, like in modern times, we have in some places, they'll give you a number like, oh, we have 5% unemployment nationwide. How come in this one urban center between this one demographic, we have like 80% unemployment?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, this is the thing, is it's never equally distributed, right? So you can have bureaucracy in the capitalist sense where you have like the peerage system and, oh yeah, you can get like a job being like assistant ambassador to Botswana or something, just because like, a guy.
Yeah.
Or you have like in the socialist sense where it's like, oh, you're going to be the, chief assistant executive comrade of hygiene, which means you're the janitor here, go mop up. Like,
and it's there's also like people whose jobs it was to just make sure that people were orderly getting on the trolleys, right? And that's fine. Like that is not probably necessary, but it is useful, and it's a good way again to give people who need work and dignity in their occupation.
And as I said, as people are starting to like intermix and move to different areas for the kinds of jobs that they do or whatever, there is sincerely, I say this, like maybe Jeremy and I as like foreigners can attest to this, like it would actually be great if like when I got to a new region, someone's job was just to like help me follow the rules. Like I'm not saying no to that. But wait, because actually, I think that this is really.
And they don't give that person a gun either. It's not like like there was very little like, guys with guns and badges and stuff. It's like, oh yeah, he's an official. Technically, a lot of stuff is illegal, but don't worry about it too much. Just be cool.
Yeah, I mean, he's an official. He's an official the way that like a mail carrier is official, right? Like they have government employment, but that doesn't mean that it's like a carceral enforcement of law.
But if you punch one, you do go to jail.
But this, I don't know. My dad was a mail carrier for a long time. Okay.
I never punched your dad. I swear.
I'm gonna ask, but between the two of you, let's be so for real right now, neither of you would be able to remember for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, but my point is, because there's actually a bigger point here that I find really frustrating, and we have fallen into the Trotsky trap of like taking him at his word. The solution, right? Wait, there's a few things. One, the solution to too much bureaucracy is not to elevate the Fourth International and just like fucking make revolutions everywhere, because making revolutions everywhere, if I'm understanding this correctly, would mean war, which means the military. And I'm so sorry because I'm not an expert in this, but some of you know more about this than I do, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Is the military not also just like extremely bureaucratic?
Well, but if Trotsky's at the head of it, then no, it's actually okay.
And so he finishes this document by saying that the goal of the Fourth International, wait a second, because this is like even bigger than all the other critiques. He finishes this like little email by saying the goal of the Fourth International is to purge the world of Soviet bureaucracy. Like, babe, I'm so sorry, but the primary contradiction right now is capitalism and the rise of fascist nationalism. It is not too many office workers.
No, yeah, this was the time, 1918, 1919 specifically, like at the end of the First World War was like so many strikes, like they called it like the Red Summer and stuff. Like there was all these uprisings, you had all this stuff going on in it, and it's like none of those contradictions have been solved. They've just been violently oppressed, right? Since then. Yeah. And you've gotten to this point because of the failure of, social democracy in the Weimar Republic and because of a million other factors, right? But you have right before that period, you have like what they call the interwar period is such a European focused thing because it's like, oh yeah, and then we didn't have any wars. It's like, no, all of the imperialist nations were doing huge fucking wars with like war crimes and gas and biological agents and stuff in Africa and Latin America. It was like the US was in the banana wars, which is, we can't even call it a single war because, for instance, during that time, there were 7 invasions of Honduras.
Yeah. And not to mention in the Soviet Union, the Civil War, as they call it, which was in fact an imperialist invasion in order to restore the Tsar. I mean, that was also a war, was it not?
Right.
Although Trotsky also had an interesting role in this because, so November 11th, 1918, right? The guns fall silent. Trotsky that day chooses it to launch this enormous attack against the U.S. troops that were in the West, like at Archangels in Murmansk. And one of the things that they started doing a lot of times was they had like radios that they would play messages in English and be like, hey, Americans, your war is supposed to be over. Why are you still here fighting us? Don't you want to go home? And like all this stuff, like, that's typical in any war. Yeah. Like, you always have propaganda messages, but he was really like keen on, maybe we can get the Americans to rise up in like a socialist movement against and it's like, come on, guys, like this is a bunch of kids from Michigan, like they're not going to read your book.
As I said, if you take out everything, if you take out the context, if you take out all the parts where Lenin says, we can't manufacture the material conditions for revolution, but we can work hard to correctly analyze them and like know when to act. Like as long as you forget that was like the core tenet of Lenin's framework, then I guess you can make that argument. I want to bring up another little piece of permanent revolution so that we can maybe stop talking about it, which is, and I have to I'm going to make a confession in this moment. So thank you all for holding me gently in this. The other piece of permanent revolution, right, is he's like, you can just kind of bypass industrialization and just like go be socialist, which I want to remind you who else pushed that line. A little guy you may have heard called Pol Pot.
Oh, well, yeah, totally different direction here. Yeah. Yeah. We're going to all be agrarian. Everyone has to leave the city, but it's just temporary.
It was like, we don't need to develop. We can just be socialist now. And so, one, right, like, first of all, keep in mind, as I mentioned before, like the contradiction of both criticizing Russia. He was criticizing specifically Russia in the document, not the Soviet Union, but Russia for being too backward, but also saying that they shouldn't industrialize. And like, listen, I have really struggled with this. And I can be honest and say that like that idea is like kind of attractive to me. As I've said many times, I'm an eco-socialist. I care very deeply, not just about preserving indigenous cultures and lifeways, but also about genuinely seeing these people and their wisdom as having something very important to teach humanity. So there's a part of me that loves the idea of bypassing industrialized capitalism and just like flying high into socialism, right? I desperately would love for that to be the case. But again, this is only relevant if you can suspend the material conditions. I'm so sorry that I'm like really just like hitting the nail over the head with this, but they're fighting wars, which again requires materials, weapons, vehicles, and all of that. You have two options aside from just like laying down and losing. And it's either developing their own industry or becoming subservient to another country who already has developed industries. Right? And so this is kind of like all I wanted to say about the differences between socialism in one country and permanent revolution. And I think 100 years ago when we started this conversation, the question was about seeing the value of socialism in one country and the aim that he was trying to make. And I hope that you can see that the aim that he was trying to make is like what kept the Soviet Union alive during this period. what helped defeat fascism, or at least temper it. Clearly, we live in the now and it has not been defeated, but in that moment, there was a victory against fascism.
Not at first, though. At first, it was just like loss after loss after loss, like retreat, like move all of the factories, take everything apart, put it on rails, move it to the interior of the country to slow down.
For sure.
And it looked bad. Like,
but
things looked
you're
real
that,
grim for a while.
But even that is you're making the comparison between like that and a potential better outcome. And what I'm trying to make is a comparison against what happened, even though it was lost and looked bad, compared to what would have happened had they were like, we're at war with the whole fucking world.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you also wouldn't have had people in all of these Eastern European countries willing to, be armed and supplied and like coordinated with the Red Army if the goal was then, hey, by the way, once we're done with this, your country is not going to exist. You're going to be a province. Like they would really have had a problem with that.
Yeah. And I think people like forget when it comes to what were the alternatives to socialism in one country, right? Of course, permanent revolution is the one Trotsky proposed, but also like during the new economic program era, there were suggestions of kind of like a slower construction of socialism, whether that's like social democracy or even maintaining the new economic program for like decades. Those were the other options. And like the reality is that the Soviet Union went down that route. They would have been totally smashed by the Japanese at some point, who were itching to take Soviet territory. The Germans even earlier than 1939. And it's like, of course, the fact that the Soviet Union industrialized and communalized agriculture, etc., during Stalin's reign is that people say, oh, that's just like industrialization, right? It's kind of like just a purely like economic construction of the building of productive capacities, right? But it's like rooted in this theoretical framework of socialism in one country, right? It's not just some kind of abstract, oh yeah, everyone just has to build factories, right? It's like, no, we have to build factories so that we can actually construct socialism so that we can defend ourselves in the event when we will be attacked, right? Because that was
again, they will be
something that
attacked
was going to happen
again.
Yes, again and again
and again and again.
Like one of the criticisms of Stalin I never see levied that I personally have is how Lenin had made the Soviet Union like the first country in the world to legalize abortion. And then Stalin then was like, oh, actually, we're going to change that. The reason was not, though, because of like some kind of, right-wing, like
moralism,
Christian, life begins. No, it was because we need people.
Yeah.
It was like just same as we're building up all this heavy industry and kind of ignoring, like light industry and stuff. And we're building things that can be, used for war. He was like, we're going to need a lot of people. And that's now, is that excusable? Is it misogynist? Like, I would say it's not really that excusable. And it is pretty misogynist because it's kind of, viewing birthing people's bodies as like, oh, this is a factory for soldiers, but not ideal, right? At the same time, it's with like a reason that the same kind of thing as when people say, oh, well, what about Stalin did all these purges because he thought people were out to get him? I'm like, well, did he get cooed? No. So he was right.
And there were people out to get him. That is one of those things that like irritates me is that people who are from the Trotskyist camp or, believe in this like old Bolshevik bullshit, they're like,
you mean sad sack put upon old
Bolshevik bullshit. They're like, well, these people, they weren't actually trying to kill Stalin. However, they should have overthrown Stalin. And that's the thing that they were arguing for. They weren't really trying to do it. And I'm like, okay, so do you think they should have, or do you think that they weren't? I mean, like, I feel like if you're saying that
it's the Holocaust denier thing where they're like, the Holocaust never happened, but also it would have been good if it did. And it's like, wait, which is it?
I mean, I like, and you have letters upon letters upon letters where Trotsky is arguing that Stalin should be deposed, but they can't imagine that he was actually trying to depose Stalin. Like that's such a like an unbelievable concept, and it makes no sense to me.
It's not paranoia if they're really out to get you,
right? And did the Great Purge, was it mishandled? Yes. Were there too many people and people who were innocent captured in that process? Absolutely. But was there a genuine threat to the Soviet Union? Yes.
I forget the name of it. Was this one brigadier general who like found the guy who they had sent to kill him. He grabs him, holds a gun to his head, and he's like, get Stalin on the phone right now. And he calls, and he's like, I have your guy. If you want him, you need to call off your dogs. And Stalin was like, you know what? I respect it. And he didn't send another assassin or anything. It was just like, like, this guy's got some moxie. All right, cool. Like, There are some fun stories from that pretty dark chapter of history, you know?
So, like, essentially, of course, we've talked about socialism in one country ensured the Soviet Union was able to defend itself against the Nazi invasion. But also, what happened after the war, right, is in the Eastern Bloc or the socialist countries or the countries that became socialist after World War II, utter destruction and dismantling of the bourgeoisie in those countries, right? Their land was taken and redistributed. Their exploiting classes were totally wrecked, essentially, across Eastern Europe and, of course, Asia as well. We're talking Korea, we're talking China. We see this alternative form of democracy that's being presented not only to within socialist countries, but out to the capitalist world as well. People in Western Europe, in Latin America, in the Americas are just looking, being like, hey, there's another form of democracy that isn't just flipping between 2 or 3 different parliamentary parties, but is actually foundationally based on the provision of social services to its people, right? And so as a result of that, we see the capitalist class in these countries forced to create and develop welfare states to essentially prevent revolutions in their own countries, right?
Because it made them look bad.
Exactly. Made them look like absolute shit, like they were, right? I mean, of course, also the expansion of socialism after the war led to massive support for colonized peoples to rise up and overthrow their own colonist exploiters. Just in general, this prevention of capitalism expanding unchecked across the globe, right? I would say that hot take, perhaps, maybe not for listeners of this podcast, of course, but that Stalin, in light of the success of socialism in one country, is probably like the greatest or one of the greatest kind of representatives of democracy in the 20th century as a result of all those
Yeah,
things.
no, that was actually said by a whole bunch of people, including in the United
Yeah.
States. Like, like the
Yes.
Time Life like magazine, this really hagiographic piece about him, and they were like, look, a lot of the things that have happened in Soviet Russia have been pretty harsh, but they've been for the best. And then later it's like, oh, actually he's a murderer,
Yeah. He's a
right? But
dictator.
yeah, hey, wait, where was the guy who wrote the other article? Like, but yeah, just what you're saying about the decline of the ability of these imperialist countries to like project power, I think is the other important part too, right? Because you have, like, for instance, like in Vietnam, you had the Democratic Republic of Vietnam declared right after, first it's, okay, so we're dominated by France, now Vichy France, now actually Japan comes in, and then like after the defeat of all of these, it's like, hey, so can we have our own country now that we've been asking for since forever? No, of course not. You're still gonna have to you must beat 3 more capitalist bosses before you get the
Yeah.
gym medal, right?
Yeah. Chiang Kai-shek invaded them and was like disbanded their parliament and was like, hang on, do the elections again, but no communists this time. Fun times.
I love when they hold up Taiwan as like this beacon of like democracy and freedom. When Taiwan was on house arrest basically until 1989,
Yeah.
dancing was illegal, like the town in Footloose.
Yeah. I mean, same thing with
what?
with
Like, you couldn't go to a freaking dance club.
it's the same thing with South Korea. Like the
Beaumont.
Republic of Korea was a right-wing fascist dictatorship until 1991, right? Or I think it's 91.
The last point I wanted to make was that, of course, socialism in one country being successful in the Soviet Union meant that, of course, it was there to assist militarily these emergent socialist countries, North Korea, China, Cuba, eventually down the road, right? And it's like, if we can imagine an alternate world, it's probably not the best to speculate about alternate potentialities or whatever, but if we were to think about it, would these socialist countries exist today if the Soviet Union collapsed in the 30s? Because they all permanent
Because they
revolution, right?
declared war on the entire fucking world.
Exactly.
Yeah. Also, the thing is too, if you're a revolutionary country the way the USSR is, you're kind of stuck in a way supporting revolutions worldwide, at least morally, because otherwise you lose your juice. You can't say, oh, this is the Revolutionary Guard, we're a revolutionary power. Oh, you guys are revolutionary? Oh, sorry. No, you can't do that. Like, you have to at least provide something, But yeah.
Oh, you're a
Yeah.
real revolutionary? Name 3 existing revolutions that you personally supported.
You got the fashion revolution. So we're going to talk about our favorite things, which are contradictions, right? But some of the things that maybe don't seem so ideologically, shall we say, kosher. So what are some of the common threads of Soviet foreign policy in the post-war years that appear to be incoherent and contradictory? And then explain to us why they're actually very good. What should we start with?
Wait, I just want to say that, like, I guess naively, I thought that this was going to be a decade of like an ideological clash between socialism and Nazism, but like it is, but it's also like very messy and human and like wouldn't you know it, making case by case decisions and material analysis of present moment conditions. And as a result of this, it's often more led by geopolitical factors and motivators than like air quotes pure ideology. I just like want to put that there.
Yeah, like the decision to have like the landing, the second landing after D-Day, in southern France and not in the Balkans. They're like, oh well, Stalin was against that because he thought the Balkans were like his, and it's like, well, yeah, but it's also just harder to get stuff from England to the Balkans than it is to get it from freaking England to France. Like a lot of these things were just okay. Look, let's do what's practical. Like let's do what we can.
Right, right. And like shout out to you, Jeremy, my friend, who
Mhm.
had many late night calls with me, as well as to my friend Luke, who also had some calls and text exchanges with me, just explaining to me like basically how maps work and being like, yeah, the only way to go was by land or by sea. And so a lot of decisions are just made based on what's on the way. So if you, like me, are an ideologically minded person who doesn't know maps real good, hopefully this question can explain away some of the tension that you might be feeling about this period.
It's amazing how much like geopolitics is the whole study of this, right? Like that
Yeah.
the idea of the map is the most important thing. And like I quite like how Mackinder just dismisses all of the Americas and Japan as like these are like outer rim nonsense, like, you know. But anyway, so getting back to right, what were some of the things?
Yeah, so I can take us through an example. So one of the main ones I think is, and I think this appears as being some general contradiction for the popular audience, is post-war Stalin is really on the peace offensive, right? Like his goal after the war isn't to start any further conflicts with Western Europe, to start any more conflicts in Asia, anywhere. That is just kind of the line that he's taken. That is, of course, very different than the popular portrayal of Stalin as being essentially trying to like take over the world in some sense, always wanting to start conflicts, which is just like so far from the reality, right?
They just lost 27 million people too. It's like, yo, we need a pause.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like an example of Stalin's commitment to this peace process, right, is often, of course, after the war, the great powers, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, China, etc., whatever, they all meet and they come to these agreements as to kind of what this post-war world is going to look like. They do that in Germany, they do that in Korea. Of course, none of those examples turned out the most positive,
And that
but
one too was ideological purity. We're gonna not go to the UN because no, it's BS that they gave the Chinese seat to to the Kuomintang and not to the. So we're gonna boycott it. And then this is what happens when you stick with ideological purity: is now
yeah,
the US
get
gets
fucked.
to invade North Korea under the
Right.
auspices of the UN.
That's a very good point. So it's like, for these post war agreements, the Soviet Union, for the most part, I won't say always, but for the most part, they're the ones who are sticking to those agreements, right? Like, for example, when it came to the division of Germany,
Mm.
the initial idea was that East and West Germany were going to be united shortly after the war within a few years, right?
Oopsie.
And that, yeah, oopsie, big oopsie, right? And the Soviet Union was committed to this, right? They were like, fuck it. They didn't even think that a united post war Germany was even going to be socialist, democratic, whatever it is. We just don't want there to be this military presence on German soil, right? And then what does the US and the West do? They're like, actually, no, we're not going to unify. And we're in fact going to make West Germany essentially like the beachhead
Mhm.
for a future invasion that one day we'd like to
We're gonna
prosecute.
train Albanians to do subversion there. We're gonna. Oh, look at this! This swastika just rubs right off, and now we put on a little American flag, and hey, welcome to the CIA.
No, exactly. And like we've done episodes on this on Prolespod, also on my other podcast, Actually Existing Socialism.
Did you guys know Tony has another podcast? Actually
Oh, wait, is
existing
that what
socialism?
AES is in the Zencaster link?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, we're using my
All
Zencaster.
right.
But yes, no. So yeah, we do many episodes discussing these issues, and so when we think about say for example, the Korean example, this is probably the starkest one, right? Is that the idea was that soon after the division of the Koreas, right, it was occupied by the Soviet Union in the north, the U.S. in the south. Was that both the militaries were eventually going to leave and let the Korean people decide for themselves how they were going to proceed, right? And in this post-war period, there was, I can't remember the name of the specific organization, but there was a peninsula-wide organization of like essentially people's councils, right? That were unsurprisingly left-leaning, socialist, etc., right? And the US was like, you know what? In Southern Korea, we're going to make that organization illegal.
Yeah.
And they'll have no ability to promote or do any political activity. Meanwhile, the people north were like, sure, like you guys can do whatever the fuck you want. And the Soviet Union, the Red Army pieced out, like I think months after, like they were barely there. The US military is still in South Korea today in 2025, right?
Several divisions of it, plus like nuclear and like carrier groups, and oh my god, so much. Like if you are in any branch of the service, you're probably going to wind up in Korea at some point. Like almost everyone I know who's been in like the Navy or the Army has been stationed in Korea for some period, and it's grim.
So it's like, yeah, so that's just like one example is like this the tension between Stalin's peace movement, but also ensuring that the new socialist bloc in Asia and Eastern Europe is also protected as well, right? Because it's like, on one hand, you're not going to start a war, but you're definitely not going to let yourself be open to being fucking annihilated by one, right? And so the Soviet Union.
Look, I'm not starting any fights, but I will finish one.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a cool line to say, so I appreciate that. I wasn't sure. I was like, I don't know. But so that's what I was going for,
But
right?
yeah, I mean, the Korean example, I think, though, is also really stark because there's this accusation that has been leveled for like since the Korean War against the Soviet Union that, we were getting our pilots shot down and then we listened to the radio and they were speaking Russian because, you know, your average guy from like West Virginia can't tell Korean apart from Russian. But it was like the idea that, it must have been Russians shooting us down and not Koreans. And it really just comes from racism, right? China, in a big way, came in like for Korea, like later in the war. But the Soviet Union was like, we need to avoid this, right? Like,
Yeah.
Especially because at the end of it, they were seeing, hey, we're behind in this nuclear technology, you know, like, the Soviets were spying on the nuclear program. The U.S. is spying on the Soviets, spying on them, you know, with the Verona project and all that. Or Venona. Yeah. The
Venona, I think.
project where they had the one-time pads that weren't so one-time. Yeah, anyway. A fun fact about this, too, you were talking about before about like how if you don't develop industry, you're dependent on another countries. So one of the things that the U.S. refused to give the Soviet Union in Lend-Lease was the B-29. And why would that be? Maybe because it's a nuclear capable, like, bomber thing. And so the Soviet Union, however, there were a few that had to like land there in emergencies. Like, you know, they just needed a landing strip. So they had to land in the Soviet Union, like Vladivostok. And so the Soviets were like, we'll just reverse engineer this. And they did. But the US does everything in inches. So they were like, okay, this is 1.58 millimeters. Put it 1.6, right? So they had to round up. And so the Soviet one wound up being like 400 kilos heavier. Really didn't affect it that much, but it's just funny that, you know, the Soviets can build the exact same thing as the US, and then they're like, but it actually weighs more.
So yeah, I think another example of these kind of contradictions during this period is like there's essentially a new socialist family of countries that emerges, right? So they all kind of have to figure out how to like play nice with each other, right? It's
and they
like,
don't.
well,
In the case of Yugoslavia, by 48, they're like, no, fuck this guy's no.
yeah, no, that's a good example, right? It just like, is the Soviet Union the boss of us? Do we follow orders? Do we take orders from them? Do we not?
Do we allow their troops to come through our territory to get to their commitments in East Germany, for example? You know, which is like part of why also you want to get out of East Germany. You don't want to occupy it that much. There's plenty of German. There were more German communists before the war, but there's still plenty who came out of hiding and everything, you know, that you can hand it over to. So it's, I mean, basically all of the guys in the GDR were like, yeah, they'd spent the years in hiding or like in exile, because if you'd been living in Germany, it'd been a little bit rough, but yeah. But like the idea of, you know, getting out of these kind of commitments and getting back to like rebuilding the country, because, you know, it's like if you look at the thing about, you know, you killed 100 million bajillion people, and it's like, well, population seems to be going up, and then it goes starkly down in the war years, and then it starts recovering again. But it's like, hey, you are gonna need people, right? You know, but for instance, like I think there were a lot of provocations too that the Soviet Union wasn't ready to respond to until their first nuclear test in 1949. A good example of this would be the Berlin airlift, the whole, we'll just fly all these planes in, like, where it's like, the Soviet Union could have responded to that. A lot of the provocations that the US made in Western Europe, they thought, oh, this is going to start a war. And then it doesn't. And they're like, ooh, we can push further, right? Okay, so in terms of other, contradictions and stuff, let's get into one that is going to be really relevant for today, right? Which is like, okay, what do you do about, and whenever we have an ethnicity or a race or a religion followed by a question, it's never good. But what do you do about the Jewish question, right? And so at first, obviously, Zionism is like the laughingstock of the world. And this is not just in the Soviet Union. This is not, in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe or in the US. Zionism was fringe. It was a joke. It was something fucking weird. And when, some guy would come around to shul with like a little collection, oh, would you like to give a couple pennies to establish a homeland in Palestine? You go, yeah, okay, sure, homeland in Palestine. Yeah, that's good. And if you read too, like Theodor Herzl too, he's considered, the founder of like modern Zionism and all this stuff. And if you read Der Judenstaat, like the Jewish state, his proposal is to create basically an East India Company, but in Palestine. Or maybe Argentina. He talks about that too. He says, oh, well, it could be Palestine. That's our historic homeland. Could also be Argentina. That'd be fun. There's some good land there. And it's like, okay, so he wants a British protected investment company. So of course the Soviet Union is not going to be for this at the time, right? The thing to understand when people are like, oh, but look, how could Stalin support Zionism? It's like, well, it was a little bit different back then, right? Like, I want to give the example of a really interesting guy, this guy named Abakovner. So he's the one who popularized the saying, do not go as lambs to the slaughter, right? So he was born in Vilna, which used to be called the Jerusalem of Europe. By the way, real quick hot take. The idea of a Jewish state post-World War II to protect Jews, I think is a good one. If you do it in Europe, you know why they didn't do that? Because they were afraid they'd be socialist. Because just as Hitler believed, Bolshevism is a Jewish conspiracy, the Western powers largely believed that too, and largely acted on that belief, right? Now, Stalin looks at this and he goes, oh yeah, well, there does seem to be some support for, socialism and these sorts of things under, common in the zeitgeist of Jews. You have, before the October Revolution, the main tendency of Jews, like politically, is anarchist. And then suddenly there's a successful world revolution and all the anarchists are like, hey, so this is a nice theory, but like, we're going with the guys who are getting the goods. And then you have like all of like this like support for communism, right? And I think too, when we look at, not to jump, forward, 70 years, but yeah, let's jump forward 70 years. When you look at like the senators and congressmen and Joe Biden and stuff who support Israel and they say, oh, they're the survivors of the Holocaust. And even Bernie Sanders, who does this, what they're remembering is a completely different Israel than what exists today. You have like the way that there was a neoliberal and like conservative turn in the US, that happened in Israel so much harder and so much more directly in the 1970s and 1980s, right? But before that, you really did have Jewish socialism, Zionism, which sounds crazy because it is. But Abakovner was one such person, right? So he was, getting back to him, he was a partisan. Now, it was really not encouraged for Jews to be partisans because thing about this is when the Nazis found out, they would get extra, extra, extra mad, and then they would massacre entire villages. So they were trying to make it so that Jews would not dare to rise up against them, right? But he's seen because in the East, as Operation Barbarossa begins, there was no, deportation to camps. There was no, we're going to put them into ghettos and make them worse. It was just Einsatzgruppen. Just we're going to dig big ditches, get everyone out there, make the Russians watch, or the Slavic Russians watch, while we execute all the Jews. We tell them, if you hide them, this will happen to you. Done. Like Babi Yar, like 38,000 killed in a day, completely by bullets, until eventually Himmler said, oh, it's making my soldiers very sad. And they all have PTSD from having to shoot women and children. Oh, we should probably do something different.
We heard that recently.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh, no, it's really hard to do all these war crimes, right? But so Abakovner is doing all this partisan stuff. And then at the end of the war, he's like, what? You guys are just going to forgive Germany? No, you killed 6 million Jews. Let's kill 6 million Germans. And so he comes up with a plot to, and this is crazy considering how in the medieval period in Europe, Jews were constantly being blamed for poisoning wells and causing the Black Plague. But his plot was to poison like the water supply to a couple German towns because he wanted to kill 6 million Germans.
Manifestation.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And so he wound up actually getting caught by the British, who were like, ooh, this is bad news. So they went ahead with Plan B, which was somewhat successful, although they didn't use enough strychnine. But Plan B was actually, I think we could all say this is pretty cool. It was a POW camp specifically for SS officers. Mm-hmm. So guys who had been doing the Holocaust, like, there's no like, oh, I was following orders. Like, okay, Obersturmführer, enjoy this bread with strychnine in it. So it wound up actually just mostly making a lot of them sick. Only a few of them died. And he didn't kill 6 million people. But the whole idea of like killing innocents, right? Like here's a guy who started in his life saying we should establish a socialist state in Palestine. And then by the time he actually goes there, it's because he's on the run from crimes and shit. Like like he's expecting to be, sentenced for this like plot and everything. And okay, so he gets to Israel and he winds up actually anyone who's Jewish and also like a little bit connected to the Hebrew language, which is, by the way, modern Hebrew is not a historical language. But yeah, he was one of the people who popularized like poetry, and an interesting guy, seriously. But like you could see through his life how the idea of Zionism changed from, okay, we need to do this thing to make the world better, to I want revenge, to I think we should be strong, right? Like the reason too, a lot of Jews, even, it's, yeah, thing about Israel is it's a ethno-state within an ethno-state where the European Jews are on top, and then you have like your Middle Eastern Jews, and then you have at the very, very bottom, after they finally started allowing them right of return, like Ethiopian Jews, right? The ones from Eastern Asia, they just, oh, you have a Torah that's exactly like ours? Ooh, no. Sorry,
No,
can't
you
come here. Yeah, no, what about this? No, you don't. Yeah. But so you have this ethno-state within an ethno-state, and like our traditional language, what my grandparents spoke when they went to from Russia to the US, well, Russian Empire, right? Today it would be Belarus. Was Yiddish. They didn't speak Hebrew because nobody spoke Hebrew. But Yiddish was thought of after the war as the language of defeat. We need to be strong. We need to recreate Jews as like this strong race of people that can resist all of this stuff and actually fight and take more
Which,
stuff.
like, honestly is kind of like how they always talk about, the boomerang of empire, which is that like it actually starts with your own people, right? And we could use the example of the enclosure. We could use
Yeah.
the erasure of ethnic identity of European Jews goes outward and then eventually like sort of starts to come back, right? It's an example of that. And so it's like, to your point, Israel, the conceptualization of Israel, the conceptualization of Zionism continues to change and morph and radicalize. And the information that Stalin has, right? Because I guess the point when you brought up the contradiction, to like state this explicitly for anybody who maybe doesn't know or has forgotten, like the Soviet Union is the first country to recognize Israel as a state.
Yep.
And there's can be a lot of confusion or tension around this. But it's also important, as we were talking, this sort of like, I don't know how much I love this expression, but like Stalin's like realpolitik of making
Pragmatism.
the
Yeah.
assessment. Yeah, right? Like Stalin's like assessment of, okay, but what I do see is like, yes, as you said, like the plight of Jewish people in Europe facing the Holocaust, coming out of the Holocaust and like the ramifications of that, but also Palestine as a colonial subject of Britain. And the idea of like a self-sovereign group of people stood sort of as a counterweight. Now, is that the perfect counterweight? I don't think so. I think we could all agree, no, not just what Israel has become, and as maybe some people who were maybe more in the know than Stalin, like was to certain people intended to be. But it is certainly like when those are the options that you have before you, it is a better option than being like, oh yeah, just like stay colonized, bro. Like stay colonized by the British.
Also, the 1948 war, the one where they declared the state of Israel and then immediately are fighting, 6 of their Arab like neighbors. That's the only war that didn't have Soviet support. And here's the thing: Israel's basically been at war since its foundation, right? Because at the result of that war, of like the Israel success there, with British help, really, is the deportation and murder of 750,000 people, and going out and changing all of the street signs from Arabic to Hebrew, which is this new language invented by linguists that we're gonna all have to learn, and stop speaking Yiddish because shut up. And but how you were talking about this, stratification even of their own group. Theodor Herzl wrote about, how are we going to structure work in our new state? And he's like, well, the Slavs, and the Romanians, they can do all the physical labor, and we're not going to actually pay them in cash because they don't need it. We're just going to give them like fun bucks for this. Basically, you know how they would get paid in like company chit,
Yeah.
the railroad
Yeah.
workers, and like
Miners
that sort of thing. Yeah, so it's like we're gonna set up. It's sort of like a company town. It's sort of like a banana republic. But the point is that me and the rest of the Germans get to sit back and make the Russians do all the work. I mean, we're all Jews and we're all equal, except not so much though.
So
But yeah, like after this, you then have low intensity conflicts for a short time. The first like next big war that they have isn't until 1956, and that's the one where the USSR and the USA are on one side and Britain and France are on the other. The point is right after that, you then have explicit Soviet support for these Arab countries. And this is the thing is, how are the Arab countries going to rebuild their militaries that were like basically completely smashed in the first war? That's the other thing too, is to remember when we're thinking about, modern times and conflict with Israel versus the 1940s is, okay, the Arab states at the time had really no like military structuring at all, right? And what they did have was getting destroyed. And then who is selling them arms? Who is giving them training? Who is helping them resist this new like giant unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of their region? The Soviet Union, exclusively. I say exclusively. Iran is the big exception here, but well, anyway, we can get to that some other time. Iran is one of those strange countries where they have like MiGs flying next to F-14s because they're like, yeah, we changed sides. But yeah, like it's. I think it's interesting that Stalin was the very first one to recognize them, but it's also by being the first, it's like, well, can you say that? Oh, then he knew exactly what Zionism was going to be. Really? I mean, in May 1948, maybe not so much. Unfortunate. I think I just want to close this out with saying, like, it's not like, oh, my opinion as a Jew makes things like better or worse or whatever. I don't think we should do that sort of thing where we go like, oh, well, look, how many of the Jews don't support Israel? Because no, my opinion is in the minority. I have cousins who I do not speak to since October 2023 because I was like, this is fucking barbaric. What is going on? Have you see how they use the Hannibal directive? They're like, oh, so you think we should just be murdered? And I'm like, asshole. Like, and like, Thanksgiving's a lot less fun.
Well.
But yeah, but here's the thing is it doesn't matter if most of the Jews believe one thing or another, or if I as a Jew believe what I think is morally right, which is you shouldn't support genocide, even if it isn't against you. Right is right and wrong is wrong, And even if you have a minority opinion against genocide, that's still the right opinion.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I might know a little bit more about this because of like family background and, although we are, or no, wait, today's Sunday. I thought we were recording on Saturday. I was about to say, shit, I'm being a really bad Jew. Anyway, yeah. No, we're not, it's not Shabbos. Okay, cool. Not that I didn't like play video games yesterday before sundown, but but it's not even so much necessarily important when people tell you, oh, it's anti-Semitic to say this or that or whatever against genocide. It really isn't. The other thing too with Stalin is he'd also tried to create a place within the Soviet Union for the Jews, and it just wasn't very popular or really well.
So did friend of the pod Ho Chi Minh. He offered Ben Gurion a home in exile in Vietnam, and Ben Gurion was
really?
like, "No, cool." Yeah, they were it's one of my favorite stories of history. They
Oh my
stayed at the
God.
same hotel together in Paris. They like bumped into each other. And Uncle Ho is like, hey, so sorry about like your people's plight. We would love to offer you a home in exile in Vietnam, and they can have, like full citizenship and rights, and they can be part of the Vietnamese people because we support your cause. And he was just like, no, we're going to take Palestine. It's fine.
All right, then.
Ho Chi Minh pops up in every chapter of history where he was alive. He's just like, and then Ho Chi Minh was there.
He's like he's legitimately like the Forrest Gump of just like world history. Like my favorite story is how when Ho Chi Minh lived in Harlem, right? It's like he worked at this bakery or whatever. And it's like a few years after that, it's the same bakery that Malcolm X worked at too, right? It just like, what? How is that even possible?
If you work here, you will become a revolutionary.
Yes, essentially, yeah.
Just popping up in the back of photos like Jack Nicholson at the end of The Shining. Just like, oh, he's always been here. Let's talk about one of these things that some other groups really like to talk about, which is the Soviet Union. Well, that was just another empire, right? Now, you do have the expansion of the socialist bloc. However, I think a lot of the imperial accusations actually come after this era because of, things like in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, which is, years after Stalin's death. So let's just talk about how accurate is the assessment that the Soviet Union was being imperialist or expansionist in promoting socialism in Eastern European countries.
Okay. Just a theoretical moment of framing before Tony can come in with like actual facts and information. Yeah. Tony doesn't want to. Before a moment of like theoretical framing before maybe somebody else has some thoughts, facts, opinions, maybe one of my co-hosts.
Maybe.
I think that, the West loves to be like the boy who cried imperialism. And I think that it's important that we acknowledge that even that which we may call empire has changed and evolved, right? So for example, the Aztec Empire, the Incan Empire, Like, sure, were they doing vaguely, like gestures, vaguely imperialist things in terms of trying to like expand their rule? Did they do a bunch of things that we all agree with all the time? No. And also, the reason that Lenin, for example, specifically writes imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is that he is speaking to specific characteristics of empire that can only arise after capitalism, and therefore the capitalist class has been like at the forefront, which has never happened at this point in the Soviet Union. So to compare with the Soviet Union in any way to what like a quote unquote Western empire, or like, for example, the United States or Britain or France or any of those countries is doing, is completely fucking ridiculous, because there hasn't been this primitive accumulation that has become capitalism, that has been ruled over by a bourgeoisie that has then been overthrown, right? Before we get the Soviet Union, we have feudal czarist Russia. So I just want to say this, maybe this is a semantic point. Some people won't feel sympathetic to this, but I think it's really important that when we're talking about any kind of Soviet expansion, we're not talking about the same kind of thing. We're talking about influence versus like the extractive nature of colonial and imperial powers, which is two different kinds of relationships.
Right. So, like, I think expansionist is a better accusation than imperialist, like, for sure. Especially if you look at Finland and Poland as like the two examples that actually Trotsky loves talking about Finland. But yeah.
Please don't make me look at those two examples. I still don't know what's going on. Somebody please edit that out.
Yeah, well, so you got your poles. Those are typically like long straight things that got lights on the end of them. Then you got the fin, which is the end of a French movie. You got your fin pole and your pole fin.
We are going to screen all of our guests and co-hosts from now on for neurodivergency.
You know why Russia expanded so many time zones, but then it stops right before it gets to Scandinavia, is because they reached the finish.
Oh my God. All right, I'm canceling the episode right now.
Too many dads. Too many fucking dads.
Too many dads. Yeah.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Hey, you. Yeah, you. Are you totally bummed out by today's headlines? Doom scrolling got you down? Then how's about you head on over to Prolespod Patreon? We've got it all. You want theory beats? Yeah! Q and Ray? Yeah! Obscure declassified documents from the Soviet archives? Hell yeah! You could even chit-chat with the proles during live drops. And best of all, you can sign up for free! So get your ass in gear and burn rubber to patreon.com/Prolespod. Terms and conditions apply. Not all content is free. The proles do not guarantee relief from the general malaise associated with living under capitalism's inevitable slide into fascism. And now, back to the show.
So kind of like, to further to raise kind of framing of this discussion, right, is, Lenin's definition of empire, of imperialism. And so that conception, right, it arises from like essentially colonialism as it operated in the 20th century, right? So that's kind of what...
The late 19th too, like the scramble for Africa and stuff.
Exactly, late 19th, 20th century. So I think we should use that as kind of like the thing to compare the Soviet Union to. Is the Soviet Union doing this? If yes, they are empire. Okay, so let's go through this. Let's take a look at, probably one of the basic notions of colonialism in the 20th century is racism, right? Is putting people, those subjugated, into a hierarchy based on skin color, ethnicity, etc., to better be able to utilize that labor to extract profit. Let's just use
Hutus
that
and
as an example.
Tutsis.
But that was the example I was going to bring up, because that one is completely fucking arbitrary. It is not based on...
It's so bullshit.
It is something that was invented during the colonial era.
Like, they're all bullshit, but this one is especially
bullshit. Especially bullshit.
Like divide and conquer. I mean, that's a very good point. Is this like divide and conquer of workers, right? In the Soviet Union, we see essentially the exact opposite, right? Certainly, of course, in the Soviet Union, nationalities are protected groups of people, right? But the building of these national identities isn't on the basis of a hierarchy or that one is better than the other, but rather that it's a distinct cultural expression, right? And that's
Yeah.
totally cool to have, particularly when it's not based on exploiting other people, right? And so, as we've covered, I think, many times on this series, is the nationalities policy, particularly when it comes to the smaller nationalities that don't have as much maybe cultural or economic power under the czars. We see the
Armenia,
affirmative,
maybe?
yeah, Armenia, yeah, it's a good example. We see the affirmative action program that was put in place under Stalin, the Kornizatsia. I'm probably pronouncing it totally wrong, but they were, say, for example, preserving languages of indigenous Russians in the former Tsarist Empire. If we mirror that to what's going on in North America, right, it's the total destruction of indigenous peoples that's occurring. Literally like their cultural dances are being made illegal. Talking about Footloose, right? Like this is happening in the US. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, they're spending massive amounts of money to preserve these languages, to get publications,
to create written forms of the languages
yeah,
so that they are easier to preserve.
Right, where they didn't exist before, to integrate them into their pedagogical and educational institutions so that they are elevated, so that they are like passed on to future generations, even if you were an only child or an orphan or a, right?
Quick call out, by the way, for other Jews or just people interested in this. There's an album that it's only about 10 years old now. It's called Yiddish Glory. And what they did is they took songs that were preserved in Yiddish by the Soviet Union and they like re-performed them because they had found the sheet music and all this stuff like in like old archives, right? And you do notice, however, there is like a little bit of like censorship where there's like a few things change. Like one of the really good examples is this one's called Nitzokenlied, which is like victory song. Or no, it's not that one. It's a different one. Anyway, the point is the original line is, I shoot at the fascists so that my people can be free. And the Soviets want to change it to so that all peoples can be free, right? So this is what I mean by censorship is like, we're going to keep the original thing. We're going to keep it in their original language. But like, hey, let's make it so this line is about liberating the whole world and not just you guys, right? Like, oh no, I know which song it is. It's Mein Pulemyot, which means my machine gun.
Hell yeah.
He talks about, it's a cool song. It's like, he talks about, the Germans came to destroy everything, but then the Red Army gave me this machine gun, and now I'm gonna fucking kill every single person so that everyone can be free. And it's like, well, yeah, this is a song's written in a pretty sad time, but like, none of that was getting preserved by Israel.
Yeah.
Who did it? The Soviet Union. There's also, there's a lot of like Soviet era Yiddish stuff that got preserved. Like Yiddish was, as a language today, it's now basically centered in New York. So surprised that I'm interested in it, like the YIVO Center, like which is like who keeps it alive now is, on 14th Street in Union Square. But at the time, the Soviet Union was the only place that was trying to preserve it at all because they did see value in it, even though it's not necessarily going to be spoken. And yes, you do have to use Russian no matter where you're from. Yes, all of the manuals for things are going to be in Russian at your job. So, but like the thing is it wasn't like, oh, don't speak your first language around anyone in public because, you'll get in trouble.
Like it was in the United States.
Yeah.
Like it's a little bit like, Paul Robeson going to the Soviet Union. He's like, wow, nobody's racist to me. Huh.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very good point. Yeah. Cause it's like, so we're going back to our two columns of like empire, not empire, right?
Mm-hmm.
The West is an empire on racism and nationalities. The Soviet Union's and not empire. So that's good. Green check mark there. The next thing is when it comes to, say, for example, there's essentially wasn't perfect. No system is perfect. But in terms of like equality between the republics themselves, particularly like even going on the basis of one would think that like all of the wealth generated by the Soviet Union was all being, spent or directed on the Russian
like the imperial core, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, like the imperial core. Yeah, thank you. Like what's happening in the Soviet Union is like literally the exact opposite, right?
Yeah,
money is being disproportionately spent
and Ashgabat and all these other places. Yeah,
not just like, oh, we're gonna build the road to like benefit us in the center. We're gonna build like a whole like infrastructure for these people that doesn't necessarily help us out in the center, but it's gonna be a major boon to the people who live here, to improve the quality of their life, the opportunities that they have, and even their participation in the wider system, right? Which is not what we get in...
The imperialist model is we're going to build a railroad that goes from the mine to the port.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
Like, here in Mexico, like Porfirio Diaz, who was the military dictator for like 40 years, they're like, oh, well, he built railroads. It's like, okay, where did he build them to?
Mm-hmm.
He built them from the mining centers to the United States. He didn't connect Guadalajara and Monterrey, which are like two of the biggest cities, until 30 years after there had already been railroad lines going into Arizona to bring out the prime resources. The same thing is like, oh, we built railroads in Africa. Yeah, they wanted to build one, from Cape Town to Cairo to help connect British possessions. It wasn't so people could use them. It wasn't so any of these things could be for the people, like the U.S. and Central America. Oh, yeah, we'll build you a railroad, but we get to plant bananas alongside it. And also we get to control your mail. And also we control the railroad. And also none of you can use it. Yeah.
Oh, and you guys are slaves. Sorry.
And
yeah, oopsie.
Yeah. So then we have another column. We're going back to our columns again.
Yes.
Western colonial countries, when you take a look at how they distributed their resources within their empire, all flowing straight to the colonial metropole, the colonial home mother country, whatever, we see virtually the exact opposite in the Soviet Union. Money flowing out to the people, not in a certainly self-serving way because they're part of the same system, I guess, but self-serving particularly to the people in the quote-unquote periphery regions of the Soviet Union.
Oh, they're just giving people nice public transit because they want them to like socialism, and they're just giving them healthcare because they want them to like socialism.
That's one of my favorite arguments.
Make you sick how they propagandize. Yeah. It's like,
it's ridiculous when you say it, but it's like that was the argument, right? Or you can still see that today. They'll be like, well, they only, say for example, provided the language preservations or create languages for people so that they could be indoctrinated in Soviet communism, right? Rather than just like being able to read and enjoy life kind of thing, right? It's very
is true, but also look at their textbooks, right? Like when they would have things that would say like, oh, teaching them to read in their native language, and the examples are things like, we are all workers, they are peasants, the workers and peasants work together. Then you look at like the CIA's textbooks in Pashto that they distributed in Pakistan. It's like, my father has a gun, he uses it for jihad. And it's like, oh, so you can have an indoctrinating message and it can be a positive one, or you can have an indoctrinating message which is like designed to just get people to be your, little puppets. But like, I don't think it's bad to try to indoctrinate people through propaganda and stuff, because also you have this enormous job of how do you educate people in this system where the books are kind of wordy. Like, I really like what, Vietnam did, where they're like, we're all going to like sit down and like read together and stuff. But okay, you still need a guy who knows how to read to do that. Like you are going to need to like do kind of a lot quickly. So I don't really see a problem with, having, signs in the metro that are like, oh, all the kind of like socialist realism, like propaganda and stuff that they had, and they're like, oh, look at these propaganda messages. Like, yeah, but they're positive. They're like, look, we can work together and build a bright future. What is the deal here? Why is that bad?
I also think that for Westerners and for people who have, as you said, like everything is sort of indoctrination and everything is propagandization and everything is socialization, right? We might call it material conditions. And everyone who has been sort of indoctrinated into this Western conception of our relationship to the state, even though we're living in a period of like accelerated decline of that social contract, we hear stories about the Soviet Union and they rub us in very specifically the wrong way because we still are acculturated to our relationship of what our contract to the state is. Circling back to when we briefly brought up abortion, I feel comfortable speaking as the only one on the mic who I'm pretty sure has had one. I'm sure I've had one. I'm pretty sure you all have not.
It's true.
Jeremy's thinking about it. And so when we hear that, the idea, like you said, like birthing people's bodies, they're sort of like broods for the state. I think that we live so far. Like, do I agree with that position? Obviously, I do not. I think abortion is awesome. 10 out of 10 would recommend. But how can I explain this? We live so far from a relationship of reciprocity with our governments. We have been so thoroughly used, so thoroughly exploited in ways that I think most of us, even people who think about it a lot, cannot fully conceive of. We are products and subjects of the state in the most egregiously cruel and exploitative way possible. And so I guess for me, it's like, do I love the idea that the Soviet Union sees its citizens as people who work for the perpetuation of the success of the collective state or of the society? No, I don't love that. And I'm going to make 2 points here. One, they're operating with so limited funds, resources, access, education to begin with. As you said, Jeremy, like they just need people. But two, all of these critiques, like this is, please everyone, please underline this. All of these critiques about the limitations of the socialist transition are the argument for communism.
Yep.
That is the fucking point. That the relationship to the state will always be limited, will always be imperfect, and for that reason, we need to abolish the state. However, the most successful way we can abolish the state is through organized revolution led by a vanguard party through the socialist transition, raising the consciousness of the people so that we can fucking abolish the state and this can never happen again. And the fact that this is always used against socialism but for capitalism is absolutely fucking insane.
Yeah.
Okay, I've made my point. Thank you. Please continue.
No. That's very, very good. Yeah.
I do want to note that, after what Ray just said, right? We are recording on a Sunday. It's Sunday, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
It is, yeah.
I just want to say, Ray, you just took us to church right there. That was great.
Yeah.
That was fucking good.
I'm allowed to enter. I don't kneel when they kneel, but it's okay. I can be here.
I'm disabled. I have symptomatic hypermobility, and nobody has to kneel at this church.
Hey.
Yeah, I always thought that was kind of strange, the whole kneeling thing. I mean, I kind of get it because
This is
want
the
you to move
Church of
around.
Stalin. Sorry, I forgot to clarify that. The Church of
Nobody
Stalin.
has to kneel.
Yeah.
No kneels.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've said this a bunch of times, but like the state sucks and the state will always suck, but you need the state to get past capitalism. There's no way, to get through from capitalism to communism without a state-based socialism. It will never happen because if you try, a state will just roll the fuck over you. It happened with the Paris Commune. It happened to the fucking, and whatever, the Free State of Ukraine.
Any utopian project, really. They typically are so short that it's almost like a footnote.
Yeah, they began to collapse before the states rolled over them, but they got rolled over by a state because that's a better way to organize people when you're trying to fight somebody else is with a state.
There's also just practical stuff at this point. Like, one of the best critiques I've ever seen of anarchism didn't come from theory or any speech or anything. It came from like the sketch comedy show Whitest Kids You Know, where they're like, yeah, we've established anarchy, and then this guy comes down, he's like, hi, I'm from the nuclear plant. We need water moving over these spent reactor rods, or else everything's going to be really bad.
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, so we have to organize someone to do that? And I guess we got to get them food. Oh, this is hard. And it's like, yeah.
Okay, so essentially to wrap up our question, we got the two columns. Soviet Union has all green checks marks in the not imperial, not empire.
Let's give them an X on something. Where's one where we can say we're all very critical of the post-war stuff? How about, for instance, the Stalin-Tito split, 1948? Because honestly, it's not like I'm like think like, oh, Yugoslav socialism is the answer, or oh, Soviet socialism is the answer. I think they're both building it within their context, right? But how could we kind of conceptualize that for the listeners when they see a split between these two similar ideologies, but also quite different in the way that they're organizing? How can we make heads or tails of that? We don't have to pick who's right, but I do want to kind of maybe put an L in the column.
Sure. I mean, like, I was kind of alluding to this earlier, as in like when we're discussing the kind of like the contradictions that are there, right? Is that there's this quote unquote socialist family of countries, right? And it's like, well, how do we, it's nice and easy, like theorizing how socialist countries will interact when there's only one of them, right?
Yeah.
Now when there's so many with like total different, geographies, cultures, languages, resources, military power, it's like, how the hell do we do this, right? Neighbors, exactly. And I think that the Yugoslavia split is one of those like kind of like sobering examples of that, right? That it's like, it's not as easy as like, we're all workers trying to build this beautiful world together, right? And that there's a complexity to it. So that's sad. But on the other hand,
which actually, this isn't specifically about Tito, but there's something that Stalin writes quite late in his life. I want to say that it's in 51, and I'm paraphrasing it. He's writing about the difference between like the Marxist sort of science and scientific sciences. And it's basically on economics and economic decisions in socialism, right? That's the document that he's writing. Again, I'm pretty sure that the year is 51. It's like just a couple years before his death. And he's like, when you're talking about science and like evolution in scientific theory, a lot of it just sort of flows from one thing to the next. And there seems to be almost like lineage and continuity. And it's like you have one fact and you like build it on a new fact or something, right? And he's like, when it comes to these sort of social theories of sciences, something really enormous happens. And it's almost like every new fact, every new piece of information is like paradigm shifting to the point that it almost feels as though there is no continuity. And what seemed to make sense in a previous iteration is now, this is not the language that he's using at this time, but like is now an enormous and primary contradiction that has to be dealt with. And so I think that that's also something that we have to think of, is that as, for example, Marx is talking about the theory, Lenin is bringing it into practice, that makes the new axis is the Soviet model, right? That has been the earth-shattering thing. And then everything from there is compared to the axis of the Soviet model. And I hope if we have time, we can talk a little bit more about people's democracy and this kind of like lineage building, even though it does seem like it's like rupture as well as like continuity, right? It seems to have both of those things. But for that, it's like the Soviet Union is the new stasis. And any break and any rupture from that is literally the jump from, again, from like capitalism to what happens during imperialism. There's an element of it that it's like, yeah, that makes total sense. They're going to run out of areas and pockets to exploit and they're going to have to expand. But in the living, the day-to-day of that, it's a completely different world. It's easier to reduce it in a theoretical framework than to deal with the actual complexities and the contradictions that it creates when that happens. And the same thing happens with the socialist model, but in a different way. We have like the framework, the foundation, and that has all of its limitations of the isolation of the Soviet Union. But then with all of the benefits of the new sort of like socialist family, with all of the so-called benefits, it also raises, they're not so-called, with all of the legitimate benefits, it also raises new contradictions that can seem really like disfluent or broken in some way, but it's actually just like the implementation of these things is so like cataclysmically shifting of people's paradigms that like sometimes it do be like that.
And like, and specifically in the case of Yugoslavia too, like all of those other countries that you were talking about, like the socialist family, owed their liberation to the Red Army. The USSR is the one who did it everywhere except for Yugoslavia and Albania, who are the two that their partisan movements were so big that they managed to liberate themselves, right? And then after that, you also have, okay, now Stalin's had to make a whole bunch of realpolitik agreements and stuff because he doesn't want another war in Western Europe. And now you have Yugoslavia saying, hey, there's a civil war going on in Greece. There's the very first CIA actions also, like CIA is founded immediately. What are they trying to do? Italy, Greece, Albania. What are all of those countries? Neighbors of Yugoslavia, right? And now Albania goes really freaking badly. I mean, just absolute, just L after L for them because they really think like, oh, how come they always seem to know where we're dropping our, Albanian subversionists? It's like, Kim Philby, hey, there's a reason you got a stamp on the Soviet Union. But in Greece, you have, okay, there's an agreement that no, Stalin can't actually back the Greek communists, and they're basically doomed to their fate. And even before the Greek Civil War is over, you have Greek monarchists, Greek fascists, really, actively trying to seize parts of Yugoslavia. And so you have Tito who's looking at the Balkans. He's like, these guys don't do anything for us. We had to liberate ourselves. We had to do this all by ourselves. And now we've got this, international conflict. And we're like, hey, can we get some help? And they're like, sorry, man, we can't have a war in Western Europe when they have a nuke and we don't. And if we try to influence Italy, if we send our own version of, mobsters that we've taken out of jail and allowed to sell heroin in exchange for, strike breaking. If we do like our own version of that, the U.S. is going to get big mad. They're going to try to invade East Berlin. And guess what? Nuclear exchange is a lot less fun when only one country's doing it. Like, it's not fun in any event. But the thing is when there's more than one country, it doesn't happen, at least.
Generally.
So unfortunately, that's a big part of it. The other thing, too, is differences in the, ideological model, in the day-to-day sort of stuff. Like in the early idea of the Soviets of like all power to the Soviets, that's more or less what they're going on there, where it's like, oh, we have these like workers unions who like get to make all the decisions. And then it's like, okay, what about people who aren't necessarily in the factories because they're too old or they're sick or they whatever. Yugoslavia has a lot of its own internal contradictions to deal with, too. Also, it's a much smaller country. Also, man, if you think the nationalities and ethnic things are bad in the Soviet Union, man, holding together the Bosniaks, the Croats, the Serbs, the Montenegrins, who am I forgetting? Slovenes, I shouldn't et cetera the Balkans, but someone has just sworn a blood oath against me for et ceteraing their group. But, none of these things are easy to do. So, yeah, of course, you're going to have some disagreements in the short term. And then the other thing too is when you have that split, it wasn't like, okay, the much more important one comes later and it's after Stalin's death, so we're not going to talk about it. But it wasn't like suddenly now Yugoslavia is going to, everything the Soviet Union says, they're going to say the opposite. They're still pretty much on the same side when it comes to coming out with positions on things. They just won't echo Moscow. They'll say it in their own words, but they're still, if they see something happening that is unjust, they're not just going to be like, well, we're on the side that the Soviet Union isn't on. It's not quite that petty, at least.
So I'll end us on this note here then. Well, like say, for example, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union split, pretty dramatic, relationship between these two countries in the socialist family. What is beautiful to see, however, is the relationship between the smaller socialist countries with each other. So like, say, for example, during the Korean War, Hungarian doctors and nurses, they were all there helping out with that project, right? Alternatively, the DPRK was huge in the latter half of the 20th century, helping out. They were in Grenada. They were across the world helping out these anti-colonial revolutions, socialist revolutions, for the most part, I think. And so I feel like on that unfortunate end is the Yugoslavia thing. On the other end is seeing the solidarity that existed between these socialist countries, even the ones that had little power in the system.
Yeah, we don't have to believe that the Soviet Union was perfect and always made great decisions, but without them, none of these other revolutions happen, right? Like none of them do. It's just it's not fucking feasible. The Nazis would easily have rolled over the Balkans, probably Russia in its entirety. And that, what does that world look like? Like how does that world turn out? How many other anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, socialist movements would immediately just get squashed globally? It's just inconceivable.
Or you get funding for anti-monarchist movements and things, but they're funded by the U.S. and Britain, who, for instance, in Yugoslavia funded the Chetniks, who are just Nazis, but who want to be, Yugoslav Nazis. Like,
yeah,
they're like, look. Yeah, we don't necessarily like the Germans, but yeah, this killing the Jews thing. Now that it's like, whoa, how are you funding these guys?
Yeah,
because they don't care.
Can I use this? I think it's a decent jumping off point to elucidate a little bit more about the what I might call the socialism in one country to people's democracy pipeline.
Yeah.
Can I?
Dangerous pipeline there.
Is it? Wait, is it?
No, I'm being silly. Jokes. This is a joking podcast.
Oh, I was like, I thought that was like a fun. I thought that was like a fun name.
We do jokes here, Ray.
Okay. Okay. For those of you who might find this boring, I thought so too, but Tony encouraged me to say it anyway, so I will. If you don't like this and you would like to complain because you thought it was like an oversimplification or it wasn't interesting, please email Tony at Actually Existing Socialism.
We're gonna be holding a vote on the Patreon to see if I'll remain a member of the team. So make sure you like it.
No, Tony, we can't do anything without you. So I went over some stuff earlier in this episode, if you're still here, if you remember that far back, about socialism in one country. But people's democracy is a concept that's sort of like, I guess you could say, like a part of this lineage. They have a lot in common in that they're both models of transition towards socialism. Though context is really important because people's democracy arises out of this post-World War II context, especially in Europe and Asia. Obviously, the OGs, we've got like Poland, Czechoslovakia, similar models, China, Vietnam, DPRK. There's more. But this post-war condition is really significant because socialism in one country as a theoretical framework is arising specifically in a pre-war context with a looming threat of fascism, right? Where this arises in a post-war context with different conditions and different needs. So like socialism in one country, it speaks to countries where the quote unquote sort of worker, what we could conceptualize as the worker, isn't the sort of dominant social force, but there's also like peasantry or an intellectual class or general like anti-fascist groups, or honestly, even like bourgeoisie class traders, right? It's not just neatly like guys at the factory, right? So people's democracy takes seriously the Marxist notion that the function of the state, as we tapped on lightly earlier, the function of the state is to monopolize class power. And to understand that transitioning toward classlessness, aka communism, means using the power of the state for the people to protect workers to protect the majority against the violence of the bourgeoisie. But learning from the Soviet example, and again, that's key. They are the new sort of access. They are the new baseline. They are that which from everything else springs. So using the Soviet example, it takes a more gradual approach, again, with a sort of like temporarily minimized threat of fascism, right? It's specific sociopolitical and geopolitical, economic, all of those things, conditions that are very different at this time toward the end of the 40s, and the lessons of the Soviet Revolution without totally abolishing certain, we could say like certain capitalist elements. It still learns from the Soviet model of self-sufficiency, right? Trying to develop one's economy, trying to develop one's industries. But again, it's flexible for countries with very different and various economic conditions and social conditions that don't map sort of neatly onto the Soviet model. Because again, why would they? The whole fucking point of materialism is that you need to do it every fucking time. You need to examine it every fucking time, right? Like the Soviet model is the first one. So it itself conceives of itself in a Soviet-centric way because it has nothing to compare itself to. Like Marx is general, right? And then Lenin makes it specific. And now People's Democracy is a sort of theoretical attempt to make it general again, to make it flexible, to make it applicable to various situations. When it comes to the economy, again, learning from that Soviet example, it understands the need for like a mixed economy and the reality that classes can't be immediately abolished, right? We see, if you remember back in part 1, Jeremy and I talked about this a lot, although this was their standard and they had very, very, very high standards and metrics for success, the reality bore out differently. And so People's Democracy just sort of takes this soberly, recognizes like, okay, we learned from that example, we can't have this expectation, but what we can do is ensure that we are not allowing opportunities or creating opportunities for bourgeois people to arise or to maintain their power, and that we're like taking this really head on. And another thing, like the Soviets, especially in the early days, were happy to just like exile the owning class, right? But as this grows and as socialist style projects are really taking hold throughout the world, you start to understand, well, we can't exile everyone forever, because if our sincere aim is to just like have socialism everywhere in the world, eventually we're going to run out of places for it to go. But it is about keeping that power in check while learning from the Soviet example.
The thing you're saying about, you have to do materialism every time is super important too, because for instance, in Latin America, something that really wasn't much of a consideration in the theory written in Europe was the church and how dominant the church can be as another structure on top of the state. Probably no better example than the Dominican Republic, whose name literally is like the place of the priests, kind of thing. Like Dominic is like a
Right.
priestly, like monkly order.
Mhm.
Not a Catholic here. I don't really know, but yeah, like, so, okay.
Yeah,
how do
we
you
say monkly all the time.
Monkly is definitely...
monkly is, I looked it up before we started.
It's the first word my daughter said was monkly.
Are you Catholic?
No.
No, but honestly, that does sound
Wait,
like something
are
a
any
little
of
kid
you
would say.
Catholic? My family's Catholic. Are you all
No.
Catholic?
Wait, are you Catholic?
You didn't look Catholic.
Wait,
Yes.
are you a papist? Yeah. No, yeah, I was born a snake handler and I'll die a snake handler. Right? but no, like this is the thing is you have, and okay, like the French Revolution talked a lot about that sort of thing. Now that's, yeah, of course, this is not a communist revolution, but in terms of, successful world revolutions, they were looking at, the clergy as an important thing. By the time of the October Revolution, really not as big of a concern. Yeah, okay, the Orthodox Church has some power, but it's just kind of relegated to like a subsection of state power. And so it's
Right.
like, how do we do this when you have the church working against us? Because historically, the Catholic Church, especially in the immediate post-World War II period, becomes like, oh yeah, the Vatican, this is a place that you can use to finance subversive action and stuff. And nobody can say anything because we're the church. And it's like, okay, but this was created out of capitalism. It's a little bit like how the city of London is
I'm
different
going to
than
actually
London.
disagree that they didn't consider the church in the Bolshevik Revolution. The difference was the seat of the Catholic Church was not in South America. The seat of the Orthodox Church could definitely have been, because it was, it's complicated because the Tsar was also the head of the church. It's kind of like British fucking, I don't know. It's complicated.
It's not that it wasn't a consideration. It's just that it, again, it's different material conditions.
Very different.
Really
it was possible to subjugate the church because it was based largely within Russia or the Russian Empire, versus the Catholic Church is based in fucking Rome, and South America is not in Rome.
No, yeah.
So, or Rome is not in South America, or vice versa.
If you conquer Russia, then you also get to conquer the church. But
Yes.
you can have a revolution and take over your whole country, and people are still going to be getting messages from Rome.
From Rome,
that's
exactly.
Point,
That is, that's the distinction I think that that should be made,
And also, I think people are really surprised to understand. I won't go into this too much because, again, as I'll share, it doesn't happen during Stalin's lifetime. But a lot of people fail to understand sort of subtle distinctions about the nature of the church in the Soviet Union. A lot of the like hardcore become agnostic was very like Khrushchev in nature. I really recommend people read the book A Sacred Space is Never Empty by Victoria Smolkin. It's quite good. It's really interesting. But the role that religion played in these people's lives, in a lot of these people's lives, was not particularly orthodoxic in the sense that it didn't really change their thinking or their beliefs. It was orthopraxic. It was just something that they did. And so just like a little story about this book, again, it happens at the after Stalin's death, but essentially there are basically professional atheists, right? Their job is to sort of go around and help people divest from the church and think about different ways to engage in ritual and these certain kinds of like milestones in their lives, right? Because like all during Stalin's lifetime, people are still baptizing their babies, getting married in the church, having funerals through the church, like all these things are still happening.
Icons,
Yeah, sure. And it really wasn't that big of a deal. And a lot of people paint Stalin as like this hardcore atheist who was trying to force it on people. This is not true. It was a secular state and an atheist party, but it wasn't really interested in the project of forcing other people to be atheists. But as this begins to happen after Stalin's death, the professional atheists go into these people's homes and like talk to them about like, oh, you're playing cards, isn't that gambling? Or, oh, you're, I don't know, drinking alcohol in front of the Virgin Mary or this religious iconography or whatever. And all the guys are like, yeah, whatever, who cares? And so actually the professional agnostics, as I said before, the Soviets are very ideologically minded. They care a lot about integrity, being integrated in their beliefs, thoughts, words, and actions. And that is their like only metric of success, which we see sort of like mellows through the conceptualization of people's democracy. But the professional atheists like all come back and they tell everybody, they're like, guys, in order to make these people good atheists, we'd first have to make them good Christians.
The other thing too, there's a book I also want to recommend is Yiddish Land. And it talks about how before the Second World War, so 1930s, the concept of Judaism was changing within the boundaries of the USSR because of proletarianization, because of industrialization, because you're going into cities and you're no longer confined to the Pale of Settlement, confined to only certain jobs. Suddenly, you're going like, and there's one story in there, it's presented as like a bunch of different stories from different people and their lives. A lot of Jews at the time when we were living in the Pale of Settlement, back when ever since Katerina said, hey, this is where you guys are allowed to be. You cannot do agricultural things. If I conscript you to the military, you're doing 25 years, but just have the funeral for the person because they're not coming home. That's what they would do at the time.
Hey, but if you were really, really good at something, you could leave the Pale of Settlement.
Yeah.
If you were really
never
good.
come home.
But yes, it's fucked up.
You were and you had to change your last name but they were like, there's one story where this guy's talking about, he wants to go to this like socialist reunion that they're having and everything. And one of the guys says to him, look, man, you got to cut your payas, like, which is the little curly things that like Hasidic Jews like will have and stuff, which by the way is not actually a commandment, but what they're doing is beautifying the mitzvah. So they're just, oh, well, the Torah says this, we're going to do an extra thing on top of it. So it's not like you're actually really breaking a rule if you cut that off. But he did it so he could go to the meeting and, it wouldn't have this exterior marker of like being Orthodox Jewish. And then he came home and his dad punched him in the face. Right. So it's like, yeah, there was a big thing, but it was happening more because of generations and because of just, rebelling against, hey, how come dad just studies the Torah all day and we have 15 kids and mom does all the work and we live in abject poverty. And now I got a job at the factory and I can study and like I can read something that isn't the Talmud. And how come you guys don't do that? And it's like, this is the main pull on people being, religious or being like, okay, I want to keep this identity of religion, but like, oh, come on, whatever. Let's cook something other than cholent on the Sabbath. Come on, man. Like, it's just, I can only eat so many beans. Like, like people starting to break the rules, like you were saying, like with playing cards and stuff. And it's like, oh, isn't that against the rules? It's like, yeah, but this is you can see it today too, as more and more people, I'm thinking of Latin American context because I'm used to talking to a Latin American audience, but it's more and more people are going from the countryside into the cities. You're going to adopt a different way of life. Are you still part of that group, part of the original group or original religion? Sure. And you can maintain that cultural identity in another way. but it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be that religious.
I had an instructor during my master's who was honestly one of the worst instructors I've ever had in my life. However, his field of
Shout out.
study, I'm not going to name his name because whatever, it doesn't matter.
Come on, be messy.
His field of study was on Islam, and his contribution to theory, the theory of Islam, is that there is no one Islam. There are Islams, and it is based upon what nation are you in, what community are you in within that nation, to what degree are they peasants or proletarians, or are they the ruling class? You know, so there are multiple people are going to probably be able to figure out who this man is now, but there are multiple Islams, and you know, I think that is just a matter of like, well, that's material conditions, right? Material conditions.
Oh, you mean material conditions?
Yes, it's crazy.
It's like that photo that the liberals would show around of like, look, this was Afghanistan in the 70s. I was like, that was Kabul.
If he heard me call that material conditions, he would snicker under his breath at it, because he did that to me once in a class, and I was like, motherfucker, I fucking hate you.
Ew.
We've been talking a lot about Stalin, the leader politically, Stalin, the leader militarily, all of these sorts of big picture things, right? What about all the ordinary people? What are some of the anecdotes, some of the stories, some of the tales from ordinary people at this period of Stalin's premiership?
Regime.
Yeah, with the good governments have governments, and the bad governments have regimes,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So let's focus a little bit on some of the stories from ordinary people, your workers, your peasants, your what have you.
So sure, I can share some of those from both during the war period and after. They're each all very short, and I guess I'll have to, like, you know, maybe make a clarification for listeners, or promise to you that I won't be doing any voice acting. I'm just going to read them straight in my own voice. So I apologize for the fans of me being young, you know, Stalin's daughter in one of the narratives, but I'll have to keep it.
You could just do like a
Keep it,
completely
straight for this one.
inexplicable accent where it's like kind of shifts between different like European accents.
Yeah, so I'm known for two. So Stalin's daughter, but also Nikola Tesla.
Yes.
That's probably
Nikola
Tesla's
Tesla's the one
probably
that
most
people
famous one I've
love
done.
and or hate.
Or hate, yeah, or want to like never listen to the podcast again. But anyways, okay. So I'm gonna just read. Here's the first anecdote. So there's a woman named Anna, and she survived the siege of Leningrad, which lasted for 872 days, went from 1941 to 1944. So Anna recalled how her mother would give her and her siblings tiny portions of bread while she herself ate nothing. And one day Anna found her mother unconscious from hunger because her mother had secretly been giving the children her own rations, knowing that she might not survive, but she was so determined that she wanted to save her own children. So Anna's mother, of course, eventually died of starvation, but this sacrifice is what allowed her and her siblings to live. As you can tell, this is a pretty grim story, and I'm telling a couple more grim stories to kind of give you an idea of what the war was like for the Soviet people.
But this calls back to the commissars who would starve themselves in order to make sure that the peasants had food. It's the same mindset, which again, I don't know that I could do that I could starve myself to keep other people alive, but that is the mindset of a good communist.
I could for my kids, but for anyone else, no.
Yeah, but that's there were dozens of commissars in charge of the distribution of food during the Civil War who literally starved to death. While they had access to all this food, they gave it out to other people.
You know, the one good thing about this was there were no rats left in Leningrad by the end of the siege.
Well,
which, you could do the math on that one.
Yeah.
So this next story is from Ivan, who was a child also during the war. And he, like many people, was evacuated into the interior of the Soviet Union in a very, of course, rushed manner. So his family was evacuated from Moscow to Siberia in 1941. And in making this evacuation, his family was crammed into a freight train with hundreds of other people fleeing the German advance. Ivan's recollection of the event was that, of course, it was freezing cold. They lacked food, and particularly they're in fear of constant air raids by the Nazi blitzkrieg. But what he also does recall is the kindness of the strangers in Siberia once they arrived, who also, of course, due to the war conditions, had very little supplies, food, etc. But pointing back to this mindset, they were still open and willing to share with the evacuees. I'm going to tell this last one here, which kind of ends with some a hopeful experience. So there's this woman named Maria who lived in a small village in Ukraine. She remembers the day her village was liberated by the Red Army from the German occupation in 1943. And so she described how, of course, during the occupation, villagers were all forced to work by the Germans and lived in constant fear of reprisals. If anyone stepped up,
Slavic
they would kill.
villagers. The Jews were just murdered. But yes. Anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's a worthy clarification. And so when the Soviet soldiers arrived, unsurprisingly, they were greeted with tears, with hugs, with joy, with singing, etc. And Maria, she remembered one soldier in particular who was probably a teenager, just like she was, who shared her rations with the villagers and played with the children. Maria writes that it was in that moment that she felt hope for the first time in years.
I think it would be important to remind everyone that if you hear stories of, the Red Army doing some bad things on the road to the Battle of Berlin, it's an army. This kind of thing happens, right? Whenever you have lots and lots of people under arms, as who was the quote by about a soldier without political education is just a weapon? Was that Sankara? No. I forget who said it. You can put it in later, make me sound like I know what I'm talking about. Yeah, but for instance, one of these things that is a bit of an unfortunate historical reality is they had to airbrush that famous photo of the red banner over the Reichstag, so you couldn't see that the guy had several watches that he had taken off of dead Nazis. But here's the thing: looting dead Nazis is they had it coming. Number one, I'm not going to cry for them. But number two, it's just like, okay, and his officers didn't punish him for that? No, because you lose 1 million people in this battle. And so if someone's behaving a little bit badly and stealing some things from dead Nazis, do you punish it? Pragmatism at the end of the day, But you also have stories of like them liberating the camps and they're being, at first, people in the camps are frightened, right? And you come in and the first thing they're going to speak is Russian and then they're going to try local languages.
Yeah.
And then they were speaking to them in Yiddish and suddenly you have people really responding because they're like, wow, here's this language that we've been discriminated against so heavily for speaking. And here's this guy in an officer's uniform coming in and telling us that we're free in our language, which we thought was not going to even exist anymore. So yeah, there's, I don't want to get too much into, a lot of times when we read stories of the Soviet war effort, one really good example is sometimes we'll find that the stories passed through the censor many times and there was a lot of, and then the glorious Red Army, and you could kind of tell that, okay, they're drumming these things up. But there's also contemporary stuff that exists in things like songs and literature.
Mm-hmm.
There's Jewish drinking song from the time called L'chaim Stalin. And one of the things that they are toasting Stalin is for his constitution of 1936, right? So like there really is a lot of stuff that is not, post like ipso, like after the fact, looking back and saying, oh, this is good or this is bad. But here's people at the time. This is what they were singing and drinking about, hey, Stalin's the guy who saved us. And also in his constitution, he gave us a whole bunch of rights.
Following the pogroms in Ukraine and Poland and Western Russia during the Civil War, Jews joined the Cheka en masse because they were like, we're going to get these motherfuckers when the war is over. Like as soon as the war is over, we are going to come back and we're going to get these motherfuckers. And you mentioned like how so many Jewish people switched from anarchy to basically supporting the Bolsheviks because it was a legit movement. They were overrepresented in the government. That did not make the Judeo-Bolshevik myth true, but they were overrepresented in the government, in the military, and in the state security forces because it was important to them.
Mm-hmm. We're good at NKVD stuff.
Here's a story from the post-war period. Of course, the Soviet Union is going through a massive rebuilding process because, of course, as the Germans were advanced, but also were pushed back, they just destroyed everything and killed as many people as they could. But here's a particular story of a woman who came together. So this is in the Urals, and there's a factory that had been abandoned throughout the course of the war. So this group of women, they took on the factory. None of them had any prior experience with how to operate machinery, but they realized that the community needed this factory to be put into operation again. So they figured it out for themselves. They produced essential goods for that community. Despite the lack of tools, materials, they still worked hours and hours to fix the factory and to get production started. And so their efforts, of course, not only provided jobs for like themselves, but it helped to build the general national economy too. A quote from one of the women said that she was like, we didn't wait for someone to come and save us. We saved ourselves, essentially, right? That all of these communities as much help as, of course, that they could receive from the central government after the war, the central government was also like fucked too, right? I mean, talking the 1940s here in a country that's, I mean, biggest country, I guess, on earth, maybe, width-wise, if that makes sense, on the globe. But but yeah, no, it's there's just countless stories of that, of people picking up the pieces after the war, generally built on this, idea of a worker-led society, right? Because they weren't like, well, I don't own this factory, like I can't just take it up and like rebuild it. It's like, no, this is our factory and we're gonna figure it out and we're gonna get our community up and running. So yeah, so I'm gonna leave you guys with that story.
Which again, through the lens of the Western imaginary, it's this like violation of the and it's also right, like Schrodinger's Soviet Union, where on one hand it was this nanny state that was watching and controlling everything that you did, but also on the other hand, like you were owed all of these things that they were supposed to be taking care of for you or something like this, right? Like I'm not really sure which it is, but like speaking to the consciousness raising, because at this point now a generation, right, about 20 years has passed, 25 years since the original sort of like revolution, even 30 years, depending on where in the 40s and into the 50s that we're talking about exactly. People have started to like change the way that they see each other, change their relationship to their workplace, they have a sense of like ownership, they have a sense of like solidarity, they have a sense of like participation. Then again, I don't want to overstate it as an anecdotal story, but I do think that it like does point to evidence of like a people who see themselves differently than they would have before.
Yeah, absolutely.
And see their workplace as differently, and see each other differently than they would have before, a generation or two generations before.
I love that. It's great.
Yeah, so then in 1953, he's struck down by an ice pick. No, wait. No, he dies of natural causes, more or less, but natural causes is if you don't want to have a stroke, maybe you should avoid stress. And if you want to avoid stress, maybe resign your position, which he tried to do 6 times and they would not let him.
They won't let him, yeah. It's like that fucking meme where it's like, can I please retire? And then it's like, no.
The like masticated,
it's just like
emaciated
Stalin. Desiccated Stalin, just like
desiccated.
Like, hey, it's time for your Politburo meeting. Yes, dear.
Yeah, but I like he did to some degree do this to himself. He slept like 3 hours a night, and he just
Also, as we all know from a previous anecdote I told about the cigarettes, he was a heavy smoker.
Oh, yeah.
He answered pretty much every letter that was ever written to him.
Yeah.
Even if he didn't answer it, somebody else answered it, and then he read it and was like, yep, that's me, and then signed it, Like he was there. He was in the fucking trenches. He was on the ground.
So I know that we have quoted extensively friend of the pod, Anna Louise Strong, but in a piece called The Soviets Expected It, that was published in 1941, even if we are talking about the end of Stalin's life, I think that like these kinds of stories speak to the man that he was and the way that he was experienced. She tells like a part of the story about how like Western media portrays him in a certain way because basically these like Western imperial government leaders he like doesn't have time for and he doesn't want to meet them. And she goes on to say, we may even come to hear Stalin spoken of, as a Soviet writer once described him, as the world's greatest democrat. When I met Stalin, I did not find him enigmatic. I found him the easiest person to talk to I ever met. Now the reason, right, she's speaking to the enigma is because, like I said, it was like, oh, he's so mysterious. He won't meet with any of these like horrible fucking war criminals. He is far and away the best committee chairman of my experience. He can bring everybody's views out and combine them in the minimum of time. His method of running committees reminded me somewhat of Jane Addams, of Hull House, or Lillian D. Wald of Henry Street Settlement. They had the same kind of democratically efficient technique. If Stalin has been inaccessible to foreigners, there were exceptions even to this, that does not mean he lived in isolation in a sort of Kremlin ivory tower. There were close to 2 million people keeping him busy. He was seeing a lot of them, not always necessarily the party leaders, a milkmaid who had broken the milking record, a scientist who had broken the atom, an aviator who flew to America, a coal miner who invented a new labor process, a workman with a housing difficulty, an engineer balked by new conditions. Any person representing either a signal achievement or a typical problem might be invited by Stalin to talk it over. That was the way he got his data and kept in touch with the movement of the country.
Boom.
That's one thing that I love how, like, I guess maybe I never really pictured like how Stalin like I guess, functioned or was like in a group of people, or like, say, for example, in a political meeting. But it's a fact that's like reiterated over and over again by people who witnessed him, was how he was able to, say, for example, act as a committee chairman and like take in everybody's ideas and like synthesize it and like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's a quote in the same piece where somebody says he even pays attention to the way grass grows. Just talking about how he's just like always like listening and looking for information.
Yeah. It's really the opposite of like the evil dictator who is
disconnected from
deciding everything, disconnected. Yeah. And it's like, dude, this guy, like, literally, I don't think I've heard of another world leader being described like this, like, ever, right? Like, someone describe Biden
the
like
link
that?
I just sent you guys, I was trying to find it, and I did. This is the like original lyrics and how they were preserved in the Soviet Union, and then how his name got erased from it in a later version and stuff, right? But what the second verse is like, he used to look up to the stars and say like, we should build a collective farm, like, and it's like, I mean, the original name of the song is Shot Mitinsky lebt da Kaver, which means a comrade lived among us. So it's like talking about like this connection to this sort of thing, right? It's interesting. The recording they have of it is from this person who had first heard it in the 1940s, but then they're recording this in the Bronx as an older person, and they're like, "Oh, Stalin's actually bad." But anyway, here's the song about how great he is. Just like the contradictions, like throughout, like that's why I sent you guys a whole link, because I'm like, this is the Jewish like either love or hate of Stalin is like, you're never gonna find a Jew who's like, yeah, whatever, he was okay. Like, it's always going to be, he was the hero of our people, or like, curse his name. And it's like, but as the saying goes, ask two Jews, get three opinions. So that's going to be about it for this episode. So thanks to Ray and Tony and Jeremy, the other one. I know I'm the other Jeremy, but original. And to all the listeners and Patreon subscribers, the newest ones are, and there's going to be some fun names in here. So thanks for giving your money to the Proles, and now you get to troll me. Fatise, The Commune, Dumpy, Chris, Hans, Wings of Jupiter, Mayak, Patrick, Anthony, Kenneth, Miki, Joseph, Jack, Jackson, Todd, Derek, Ben, Blursville, Michael, Daniel, Powell, and Sakin. And a special shout out to the Vanguard Patreons, who are better red than liberal, the Winking Cossack, Talking Socks, Carlos Marx, and Comrade Chihuahua. And if you'd like to subscribe, you can do that at patreon.com/Prolespod for free, but it's better if you give money, because that's how everyone sustains themselves.
True.
Yeah. Anyway, so if you have any questions or comments or episode ideas, please email prolespod@outlook.com. Really? Outlook.com, guys? Really?
Yeah.
I mean, whatever. I'm not
We
gonna
lost
judge
the
I mean,
Gmail.
I just did, but like, but at CompuServe.net. No, please email prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all the algorithm stuff, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
Death to America.
He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.